quote, a unilateral and gangster-like demand for denuclearization. Talks going great, and then our side is accused of being gangster-like? For the president to say that North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat, and then have North Korea's foreign ministry come back and say what they said, shows the disconnect between President Trump's rhetoric and the reality, and the sheer incompetence of this administration. For those who say, and I hear it all the time from many of my Republican friends in my state and throughout the country, they say, look, we don't like the president's style. We wish he didn't tweet so much, but we support him because he's, quote, getting stuff done. Take a look at the yawning gap between what the president claims and what he's actually achieved. On North Korea and on so many other issues, like taxes, like health care, for two other examples, the president makes grand promises but fails to deliver for the American people. And finally, Mr. President, one word on health care. Another issue that the president has failed to deliver on is health care. After promising far better and cheaper health care for all Americans, President Trump has relentlessly sabotaged our health care system, undermined key protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions, done all he can to see that premiums rise, probably the number one issue bothering America today, rising health care costs. Last week, the Trump administration found another way to sabotage our existing health care system, suspending a critical program that stabilizes the health care insurance markets. This comes at a time when 2019 premiums are being filed, and insurers from coast to coast are saying that the Republican sabotage is causing premiums to increase, to be much higher than they need to be. Many of these insurers are also saying that if the Trump administration enacts further sabotage, such as actions like this one and the expansion of junk plans that hurt people with pre-existing conditions, then insurers may need to amend their rates and raise premiums even more. This relentless healthcare sabotage is politically motivated, spiteful, and accomplishes nothing except to raise costs on middle-class families and taxpayers. The Trump administration needs to fix this newest sabotage as quickly as possible. I yield the floor.
President.
Majority Whip.
Mr. President, I'd ask consent that the quorum. I understand there's no quorum call in progress. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. President, this evening, the President of the United States will perform his duty to nominate a person to serve as the next Supreme Court Justice, to fill the vacancy left by Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy, who announced his retirement at the end of July. I look forward to joining the President this evening, along with a number of my colleagues, for that historic announcement. It's an important day because the person selected will help decide many cases that will have a deep and lasting impact on American history. Certainly, Justice Kennedy played that role many times in many close cases. But there are a great many talented men and women that are qualified for Justice Kennedy's seat, I believe, and that's why the President's choice is so difficult. All of these candidates that have been identified as a potential pool of candidates have the intellectual capacity that has developed over many years, along with a rigorous understanding of the law. They've demonstrated their analytical skills in a variety of ways by studying at top-tier law schools, clerking for well-respected judges on the Courts of Appeals and Supreme Court, in their public speeches, in their courses they've taught, in the articles they've published, and working, of course, at the highest levels inside government and prominent law firms. And, of course, in the case of the final four, serving on an appellate bench, the mid-level intermediate federal court, which, for all practical purposes, in most cases, is the court of last resort, since the Supreme Court only hears roughly 80 or so cases a year. I know the President's considered a handful of these jurists, and who's revealed actually a list of potential appointees to the court when he ran for president. And I think that probably was one reason why he was elected, because when people saw the quality and the experience and the qualifications of the individuals that he said he would consider for the Supreme Court, I think it gave them greater confidence that he would choose wisely, given the opportunity as president to appoint somebody to the court. These individuals, of course, who are in the pool of prospective nominees have come from different academic and professional backgrounds. But I have no doubt the selection will be a good one, primarily because of the one appointment that the President has already made to the Supreme Court, and that is, of course, Justice Neil Gorsuch. Justice Gorsuch did not disappoint those of us who supported his nomination during his first year on the court. He's demonstrated not only the power of his pen, but the clarity of his thought and the force of his legal reasoning. And I'm sure that his predecessor, Justice Scalia, would be proud of the fact that Justice Gorsuch succeeded him on the court and left such a record of accomplishment in such a short time. President Trump and Justice Gorsuch taught us all a valuable lesson last year. At the end of the day, the decisions of the Supreme Court should not be much affected by the personalities or the life stories of the justices themselves. That's because the interpretation of the law should always be separate and apart from the people that apply it. And the justices and their work must be insulated from the day-to-day politics that happen inside this Capitol building and in state houses around the country. The court is not a partisan or political institution after all. That's the way our founders, the people who created this great country and our founding documents wanted it to be. Wisely, they figured there needed to be somebody who would make a final decision in the event of a controversy or a lawsuit, but the court itself should not put a finger on the scale or be a player in the partisan battles that occur here in Washington, D.C. Indeed, the court should be and is a separate and equal branch of government and must stand on its own, apart from the political biases and persuasions that pervade the District of Columbia. So I, along with many other people, am excited to hear about the President's choice. But before we begin this confirmation process, let me acknowledge the work and the legacy of departing Justice Kennedy. I want to thank Justice Kennedy for his 40-plus years serving this country on the federal bench. He's presided over and authored the majority opinion in many high-stakes cases of national importance. He may be somewhat hard to pigeonhole at times, but I think it's safe to say that he's remained committed to upholding the integrity of the judiciary throughout the course of his career. As a former state Supreme Court justice myself, I can attest that the work of a judge is painstaking, time-consuming, but obviously extraordinarily important. So we're grateful to Justice Kennedy for his willingness and his ability and his determination to carry out his important work as a federal judge. After being appointed by President Reagan and serving on the Supreme Court for the last 3 decades, he's furthered the pursuit of American justice one case at a time through calm times and turbulent times as well. He was an important member of the court that recognized the individual right to keep and bear arms of the Second Amendment, and he recently upheld the president's ability to protect national security and limit immigration from countries that have no ability to vet and to identify potential sources of terrorism in their own country. As Justice Kennedy concludes his tenure on the court at the end of the month, we wish him and his wife Mary and their children many more happy years together. Meanwhile, after the president's announcement this evening, the Senate will fulfill our constitutional role by providing advice and consent on whomever President Trump nominates. We plan to consider the nominee and his or her record thoroughly. That's our responsibility. As the senior Democratic senator from Connecticut said recently, the Senate should do nothing to artificially delay consideration of the next justice. I agree, and it's consistent with the standards set by former President Obama and Vice President Biden. In 2010, which was a midterm election just like this year, Senate Democrats confirmed President Obama's nominee to the Supreme Court, Elena Kagan. After President Trump makes his selection, senators will have the opportunity to meet with the nominee, examine his or her qualifications, and then debate them, and then vote. Vote we will. This fall, we will vote to confirm Justice Kennedy's successor. I know Chairman Grassley will manage a fair confirmation process in the Judiciary Committee. He always has. And it's crucial that as this process begins to unfold, the president's nominee not be subjected to personal attacks from an increasingly agitated and vitriolic Democratic Party. You know, my frustration is we used to debate the qualifications of an individual nominee, but with the Gorsuch nomination, we saw that anybody that President Trump would nominate would be uniformly opposed by our friends across the aisle. Based on what we've seen so far, we know that the confirmation process will certainly be contentious, and we hope that people will remind themselves of the benefits of civility and decorum. We've seen some of our friends across the aisle talk about the battle lines being drawn and other hyperbolic language. They've indicated their unwavering opposition to President Trump's nominee, no matter who that is, and before they even know who it is. That's extremely disappointing. Our colleagues' pledge to stop the nominee at all costs is not encouraging, to say the least. But I assure you, we will not back down from the fight, and we will see President Trump's nominee confirmed on a timely basis consistent with previous nominees. The stakes are too important, and the character of the eventual nominee we expect will be too high to allow these sorts of things to happen without pushing back. The American people deserve better. During the first 18 months of this administration, President Trump has nominated, and we've confirmed, 42 members of the federal judiciary, including Justice Gorsuch. So we look forward to another outstanding selection, and we will move efficiently and thoroughly throughout the confirmation process. And like I said, we will vote to confirm the president's nominee this fall. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Are we in a quorum call?
Yes, we are.
I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Sexist. A disaster for women. Totally unacceptable. These are just a few of the ad hominem attacks the far-left special interest groups hurled at a federal circuit court judge whom a Republican president nominated to the Supreme Court. The name of the federal judge? Anthony Kennedy. After President Reagan nominated then Judge Kennedy to the court in 1987, these far-left special interest groups impinged his character. They cooked up apocalyptic warnings about all the terrible things that would happen to Americans if he were confirmed to the court. Of course, the American people didn't buy it, and a majority of senators saw through the hyperbole and hysteria and confirmed that qualified nominee. And believe it or not, Mr. President, the sky didn't fall. Didn't fall. But decades later, our Democratic colleagues still haven't tired of crying wolf whenever a Republican president nominates anyone to the Supreme Court. We've seen the same movie time after time after time. Less than 3 years after Justice Kennedy's confirmation, President Bush nominated David Souter to the Supreme Court. Guess what left-wing pressure group said about David Souter right after President Bush elected him? That's right, the very same things you're hearing today. The same things you've heard from these same corners about every Supreme Court nominee named by a Republican president. One organization proclaimed that Justice Souter might, quote, undo the advances made by women, minorities, dissenters, and other disadvantaged groups. That was about Justice Souter. And back in 1975, they assailed the nomination of John Paul Stevens. They said he lacked impartiality and opposed women's rights. That's what it said about John Paul Stevens. So these far-left groups have been at these same scare tactics, Mr. President, for over 40 years. The consistency is really quite amazing. Decade after decade, nominee after nominee. The far-left script hardly changes at all. Anyone and everyone a Republican president nominates to the Supreme Court is some kind of threat to the Republic, according to the hysterical press releases that inevitably follow. No matter their qualifications, no matter their record, no matter their reputation, it's the same hyperbole, the same accusations, the same old story. Tonight, President Trump will announce his nominee to fill the current Supreme Court vacancy. We don't know who he will name, but we already know exactly what unfair tactics the nominee will face. They won't be new and they won't be warranted. We can expect to hear how they'll destroy equal rights or demolish American health care or ruin our country in some other fictional way. Justice Kennedy's resignation letter had barely arrived in the president's hands before several of our Democratic colleagues began declaring their blanket opposition to anyone at all, anyone that the president might name. One Democratic senator stated she would resist any attempt to confirm any nominee this year, quote, it doesn't matter who he's putting forward. Doesn't matter who. Earlier today, just today, another Democratic senator issued a press release declaring preemptively that he plans to oppose whomever the president nominates tonight, no matter who they are. Another of our Democratic colleagues offered this assessment we're looking at the destruction of the Constitution of the United States, as far as I can tell. It's hard to keep a straight face when you hear stuff like that. There's not even a nominee yet. Justice Kennedy just announced his retirement, and they're talking about the destruction of the Constitution. Please, give the American people some credit. This far-left rhetoric comes out every single time. But the apocalypse never comes. Americans see beyond this far-left mongering, this kind of fear-mongering they've tried over and over again for 40 years. Senators should do the same. We should evaluate this president's nominee fairly based on his or her qualifications. And we should treat the process with the respect and dignity that it deserves. The Judiciary Committee, under the able leadership of Senator Grassley, will hold hearings, and then the nomination will come to the full Senate for our consideration. One more round of 40-year-old scare tactics will not stop us from doing the right thing.
Mr. President.
The senator for Florida.
Mr. President, I would just say to my friend, the majority leader, that that's exactly what I intend to do, is to be fair, to be respectful, to talk to and have a conversation with the nominee, and then to exercise my judgment what is in the best interests of the country as well as my state of Florida. Mr. President, I'm here to talk about a condition that's in the state of Florida, which is not a very good one, because what has happened is the accumulation of hot weather with extra nutrients in the water, aided and abetted by the release of water as the level of Lake Okeechobee rises, and that water having to be released because of the pressure on the dike, released to the west in the Caloosahatchee River, to the east in the St. Lucie River. All of this has created a condition, as I said, mixed with the humidity and the heat of the summer, for the water to be so ripely laden with nutrients that algae starts to grow, and then it starts to bloom, and then it starts to get excessive. It's toxic, it's slimy, it's called blue-green algae, and it's a bloom that is spreading over those waterways. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of waterways in Florida because of excess nutrients that, in fact, have now the growth of algae, but this is particularly acute to the east of Lake Okeechobee and to the west of Lake Okeechobee. This past week, this senator went from one coast to the other. I started in Fort Myers, examining the Caloosahatchee River, talking with the elected leadership and environmental leadership. I then flew on to the lake, landed at the Pahokee Airport, went to the Belglade Marina along with my colleague from Florida. That's his district, Congressman Alcee Hastings. We had a town hall meeting there and were able to announce some good news that, as we had requested, Congressman Hastings, Senator Rubio, and I had requested to use the disaster relief money for the hurricanes, which was the last tranche, was upwards of $80 billion, to use a portion of that to help us speed up the acceleration of the construction of the dike so that the dike can be reinforced, that the lake can hold more water without the communities around the lake being threatened that the dike might give way because of the pressure of the water, the higher the level in the lake. We were able to pass on at that meeting the announcement of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the White House having utilized part of that money in their recommendations, utilizing that $80 billion as a source of money to speed up the dike. And that was a very welcome announcement, but it's only one part of what's got to be done, and the algae is still there. The one thing that I heard over and over from the people is they're worried about the potential health risk. These are health risks associated with the algae bloom, and they feel like that they're not getting timely, accurate information on what to look for and what they should do if a bloom takes place in the waterways in their particular area. Now, I want to give you some idea. These are pictures from 2 years ago, but they're fairly accurate as to what we're seeing today. You can see this blue-green algae here, located where some boats are tied up. You can see the effects of this same kind of algae out in more of a brackish water estuary, but you're talking about some serious growth of algae, and that's not pretty. And let me tell you, when this stuff starts rotting, the smell is awful. But the question is, what are the health effects of this? And the people are demanding answers, and they want to know, and they should know. One young woman in Fort Myers told me about something that was really rather surprising. She is a diver. She had been 20 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico, and there she encountered the slimy green algae that is usually in more of the freshwater and perhaps brackish water waterways. She said she couldn't believe it. She told me that she was worried that she may be exposed to not just toxic algae, but also to the red tide as well. Now, that's another phenomenon that occurs in a water like the Gulf of Mexico. The red tide periodically appears. It's a toxin, and it is very noxious to human beings when you breathe it in. And of course, what the young woman who is a diver way out in 20 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico is saying, when that blue-green algae meets the red tide, is that going to stimulate the red tide to release all the more toxins? We don't know. We got the same questions from residents in Stewart. After I left Lake Okeechobee, I flew on to Stewart, which is on the Atlantic coast. So I started on the Gulf Coast, went to the Atlantic coast by late afternoon. And there they were worried as well about the potential consequences to their health about the algae. Officials in Stewart were putting up signs in the emergency rooms warning people about the possible health risk. And they were urging them to report any algae sightings or exposure to them as soon as possible. But even with those precautions, we still don't know the full picture of what the algae could mean for people's long-term health. Well, Mr. President, that's why I have written to the Centers of Disease Control, the CDC, to ask that they provide the people of Florida with the information they are needed to have, including the warning signs that they need to have to look out for the immediate health risk associated with swimming in or near the algae, or even breathing it in. And that's just the short-term effects. I've also asked the CDC to look into the possible long-term effects of the algae exposure so that we can begin to take whatever protective steps that we now need to protect people living in and around these blooms. So, Madam President, I ask consent that my letter to the Centers for Disease Control be inserted in the record.
Without objection.
Just last week, the Army Corps of Engineers had announced that additional money, the $514 million in disaster supplemental funding for the Herbert Hoover Dike, and that will complete that project earlier than 2025, accelerated to 2022. Senator Rubio and I requested that. This funding is on top of what we've already spent over a decade and a half of $1 billion shoring up the dike. This didn't just happen yesterday. This happened 15, 20 years ago, and we've already spent $1 billion. Well, we're going to get it accelerated all the way to 2022. That's coming in time. But while getting that additional funding to speed up work on the dike is certainly good news, it's important to remember that fixing the dike is important to public safety to protect the communities that are living around Lake Okeechobee. It's not the solution to ending the discharging, and it's not solving the algae crisis. It's one step on the road to try to stop all of this algae bloom that occurs every year. Once that dike is fully repaired, the Army Corps then expects to be able to store about 6 more inches of water. In a big, big lake like that, that's a lot of water. Now, that's good news because that flexibility helps, especially during the algae bloom breakouts, because you can hold more water back in the lake and don't have to dump it into the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee. But the only way to end those damaging discharges is to move ahead with Everglades restoration projects north of the lake, as well as the projects designed to take water from the lake, clean it, and send it south as Mother Nature initially intended it to go. And that's why we need to get critical projects like the Central Everglades Planning Project and the new reservoir in the Everglades area south of the lake moving as fast as we can. And to do that, we need more than the small amount that the president has requested for next year. In fact, we need upwards of $200 million a year to really start making progress in restoring the Everglades. Voters in Florida overwhelmingly passed a constitutional amendment to dedicate a portion of the documentary stamp tax to land acquisition for environmental projects. That's why Florida is so sensitive to the environment. The voters voted upon themselves an increase in the documentary stamp tax. But what has happened is that the government of the state of Florida hasn't been using that money for what the people intended when they voted in a referendum. Instead of using that money as it was intended, the state of Florida has tried to divert it to other purposes, such as filling in budget shortages or employees' salaries or other unrelated to the environment expenses. And now we've got suits, it's tied up in litigation, it's further distracting from the overall goal of restoring the Everglades. The federal government should take the lead and do what's right. We should move forward and fully fund the only ongoing Everglades restoration projects. And we also need to get the U.S. House of Representatives to pass the harmful algal bloom reauthorization bill, which was introduced by this senator. The Senate passed it unanimously a year ago. This bill would reauthorize funding for the federal task force that is studying the harmful algae blooms like the one that I have been describing here. I hope every member of the Florida delegation, especially those that are in areas where water is allowing algae to bloom, that you will join this senator in calling on the Speaker of the House to take up and pass this important bill in the House. And we need to do it fast while all of this algae is blooming, and that would be before the House goes out in recess for their August break. Time is critical, and again, I want to show you what this algae looks like. You can see these thick chunks on the surface of the water where it almost looks like a blue-green carpet. And when that algae dies, you can't believe the smell that comes off of it. It's time to act, and it's time to act is now. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection.
Tonight, the President will announce his nominee for Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And that announcement's because of the vacancy created by Justice Kennedy's recent retirement. Justice Kennedy left an important legacy of more than 3 decades on the Supreme Court. I voted for his confirmation 30 years ago. Justice Kennedy demonstrated his deep commitment to our constitutional liberties. It is no surprise that some of his greatest opinions defended free speech and religious liberty. I hope that Justice Kennedy's successor carries forward this legacy. I'm optimistic that the person the President nominates tonight will be highly qualified and committed to the rule of law. I'm optimistic because President Trump already appointed one such Supreme Court justice, Neil Gorsuch. The President's selection process is the most transparent in history. He issued a list of potential Supreme Court nominees directly to the American people during his 2016 campaign. To my knowledge, no other presidential candidate has ever done that. The list demonstrated the type of judges that he will appoint to the bench. The American people voted for President Trump in part because of that list of names and what it reflected, and his promise to nominate these types of jurists. Any of the 25 individuals on the President's list would be an excellent choice and worthy of the Senate's serious consideration. But already, we're seeing from liberal outside groups and some of the Democratic leadership a desperate attempt to block the nominee, any nominee, by whatever means necessary. Democrat leaders have pledged to block anyone from the President's list without even knowing who that nominee is, and regardless of his or her qualifications. Now think about that a while. The President has a list of 25 names, but some Democratic leaders have already said that not one of them is acceptable. Zero out 25 highly respected, highly qualified individuals, not even worthy of this body's consideration. That's an incredible statement by some of the leaders on the other side of the aisle. This preemptive attack on a yet-to-be-named nominee is a preview of the obstacles and calls for needless delays that we are sure to see from some of my colleagues. I've already heard several weak arguments made in an attempt to delay the confirmation hearing, but the Democratic leaders have shown their hand. The motive is to block any nominee from the President's list. Whatever reasons for delay, it's clear that their single motivating factor is blocking the nominee selected tonight, whoever he or she is. The first delay tactic I heard was that the Senate shouldn't confirm a nominee during a midterm election. But the Senate has never operated like this. Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer were confirmed in mid-year election years, in addition to many justices who served before them. Democratic leadership and outside groups are so desperate to block this nominee that they're willing to rewrite history to do it. We have a long history of confirming justices nominated during a midterm election year. We don't have a long history of confirming judges nominated during a presidential election year. It's been nearly 80 years since we've done that. Former Chairman Joe Biden announced in 1992 that the Senate shouldn't confirm any justices during a presidential election year. Senator Schumer said something similar in 2007, the year before the presidential election. The Biden-Schumer rule pertains only to presidential elections, not to midterm election years. So it's important to let the American people decide who should choose a nominee for a Supreme Court vacancy. That's why I waited until after the 2016 presidential election to hold hearings for a Supreme Court nominee. But the individual who selects nominees, the President of the United States, is not on the ballot in midterm elections. The rule simply doesn't apply during a midterm election, and that's this year. Another losing talking point is that we shouldn't confirm any nominee while Robert Mueller's investigation is ongoing, and who knows when that's going to end. This argument, again, is inconsistent with the historical precedent. Look at what President Clinton was involved in, an investigation of that president over Whitewater. At the same time, Justice Breyer was appointed to the Supreme Court at a time an independent counsel was doing that investigation. At the time, his documents were under grand jury subpoena. What other constitutional powers do the proponents of this argument believe that the president should surrender simply because of an investigation? This is obstruction masquerading as silliness. What drives this preemptive obstruction, you might ask? It's liberal outside groups' stated fear that the president's nominee will vote to invalidate the Affordable Care Act or overturn Roe v. Wade. Well, the same 5-justice majority that preserved the Affordable Care Act is still on the court. Justice Kennedy voted to strike it down. Replacing him with a like-minded justice would not change the outcome. And we hear the same thing about Roe v. Wade every time that there is a Supreme Court vacancy. It was a big deal when Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed to the court 37 years ago. Yet Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land. It's pretty clear. Justices have a way of surprising us. Who could have predicted that Justice Scalia would strike down a ban on flag burning? It's a fool's errand, then, to try to predict how a justice will rule on some hypothetical future case. But this regular uproar about Roe v. Wade shows the difference between how many Democrats and Republicans view the courts. Liberal outside groups and many Democrats have a litmus test. They seem to be very results-oriented and focusing on policy outcomes of judicial decisions. They expect, they even demand, their judges to rule in favor of their preferred policies. Liberal outside groups and their allies just simply want judges to be politicians hiding under their robes. That's why Senate Democrats were so blatant in changing Senate rules so that they could stack the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Former Democrat leader Harry Reid made no bones about making sure that there were enough D.C. Circuit judges to protect Obama administration policies on regulations. Republicans, on the other hand, want judges who rule according to the law and leave policy making to elected representatives where the Constitution prefers and demands that it be. I don't want judges who decide cases based upon whether the results are liberal or conservative. Judges should rule according to the law, no matter what their views on the policy outcomes are. Judge Gorsuch recently said that judges wear robes, not capes. I agree with that assessment. Liberal outside groups and their allies want judges who will decide cases with liberal policy results. Republicans expect judges to leave their policy aside when deciding a case. That's the fundamental difference that will become crystal clear to the American people during this confirmation debate. The Senate Judiciary Committee will hold a hearing for the nominee in coming weeks. Exactly when, I don't know, and I shouldn't know at this point. I want to emphasize a few things, though. One, it's inappropriate for senators to ask the nominee how he or she would rule on certain cases sometime in the near future or 10 years from now. Two, it's inappropriate to ask the nominee about his or her personal views on the merits of Supreme Court precedents. The bottom line is that senators should not try to extract assurances from nominees on how they will decide particular cases in exchange for a confirmation vote, because how do you know down the road, 1 year, 2 years, or 15 years, what the case might be at that particular time? Justice Ginsburg made it pretty simple for everybody. During her confirmation hearing in the early 1990s, she set the standard, promising in her words, quote, no hints, no forecasts, no previews. She said this in a further long quote, it would be wrong for me to say or to preview to this legislative chamber how I would cast my votes on questions the Supreme Court may be called upon to decide. Were I to rehearse here what I would say and how I would reason on such questions, I would act judiciously. This standard was reaffirmed by every Supreme Court nominee since then. So for the last 25 or 26 years, the Ginsburg rule has been what's followed by other people coming before the Supreme Court. Justice Kagan said this about Roe v. Wade following the Ginsburg rule, quote, I do not believe it would be appropriate for me to comment on the merits of Roe v. Wade other than to say that it is settled law entitled to precedential weight. The application of Roe to future cases and even its continued validity are issues likely to come before the court in the future, just exactly following the Ginsburg rule. So I expect this nominee announced tonight to likewise follow the Ginsburg standard. I'll ask the nominee how he or she views the law and a judge's role on the bench. I won't presume to know how a nominee will rule on any case that might come before the court today, tomorrow, or 10 years from now. I certainly won't be basing my vote on whether I think I'll agree with the majority of his or her decisions. The press has reported that the president focused on 6 or 7 potential nominees for this vacancy. Each one is well qualified and would make an outstanding Supreme Court justice. The nominee will get a full and fair hearing. Under my watch, the Senate Judiciary Committee will never be a rubber stamp. Several recent nominees to lower courts learned that the hard way. And the process will be fair and will be transparent as much as I can make it. That has been my approach during my nearly 38 years in the Senate and all of those 38 years on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I will not change that. The American people must be confident that this Senate has fulfilled its constitutional duty of very independently vetting this nominee before we confirm a justice to a lifetime appointment on the highest court in the land. I eagerly await the president's announcement this evening, and I look forward from hearing from the nominee when he or she appears before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I have been consistently voting against cloture motions.
Senator from Hawaii, if you'd suspend, the Senate isn't a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Is there objection? Senator from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, I have been consistently voting against cloture motions to proceed to debate on judicial nominations because the process through which we are considering these nominations is deeply broken. Today, I will again be voting no on cloture, even though the nominee we are voting on to fill a vacancy on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit is Mark Bennett from Hawaii. I support Mark Bennett's nomination, spoke on his behalf in his Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, and when debate time ends, I will vote for his confirmation. Mark is recognized as one of the best qualified lawyers in the state of Hawaii. He has served as a federal prosecutor, our state's attorney general, and in private practice. He has experience in trial and appellate work on civil and criminal matters at the state and federal levels. He understands legislating and has served in the executive branch. He has received high ratings from the American Bar Association and the Hawaii State Bar Association. He is well respected and has been honored multiple times by his colleagues. I have every confidence that Mark will put his skill and experience to good use on the bench as a fair and impartial judge, beholden to nothing but the law and the Constitution. However, as has been my practice since the beginning of this Congress and session, I will vote no on cloture on Mark's nomination. I vote this way to call attention to my disagreement and deep concern over how the Senate Judiciary Committee is conducting its judicial nomination hearings. The Senate has a constitutional obligation to provide advice and consent on judicial nominees, and I take this obligation very seriously. The American people depend on the Senate to fully consider and vet each judicial nominee. Throughout the course of their lifetime appointment, these judges will issue rulings and opinions that touch each of our lives. The process of nominating, considering, and confirming judges should be a deliberate one. Its purpose should not be to confirm as many judges as quickly as possible. Senators should be able to provide input on who should sit on the federal bench. Senators should have an adequate opportunity to hear from third-party experts about the records and qualifications of each nominee. And senators should have enough time to question and examine the nominee during the confirmation hearing. But over the past year and a half, we've seen a breakdown in the way this process should work. The president has essentially outsourced the judicial selection process to two organizations with strong, ideologically driven agendas, the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. These nominees are chosen without the consent of their home state senators, as has been the practice through what is known as the blue slip process. And by ignoring the traditional blue slip process, the president and his allies in Congress are rendering the Senate's constitutional obligation to provide advice and consent increasingly meaningless. The White House and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee have also undermined the independent processes through which the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary evaluates whether a nominee is qualified for the job. Ignoring this traditional process has resulted in the nomination and confirmation of a number of deeply unqualified judges. Some of these nominees have been unable to answer basic questions about judicial procedure or the law during their confirmation hearings. Others lack the kind of experience one would want in a person who will have a lifetime appointment to the federal court. Under this administration, we've also seen rushed consideration of many nominees for the federal circuit courts. Judges who serve on our circuit courts are only one step away from the Supreme Court and deserve to be scrutinized closely in the Judiciary Committee. Over the last year and a half, however, the Judiciary Committee overrode the objections of the minority to hold an unprecedented six nomination hearings with more than one circuit judge nominee considered simultaneously on one panel. This means that members of the Judiciary Committee have only 5 minutes in total to ask questions of not just one, but 2 circuit court nominees, including the time it takes for them to answer our questions. This is scarcely enough time to vet these nominees, many of whom are highly controversial and deserve maximum scrutiny. The American people deserve much more as we consider lifetime appointments to the federal bench. Until we return to a normal process through which we consider lifetime appointments to the federal bench, I will continue to oppose cloture on each of these presidents' judicial nominations and encourage my colleagues to join me in this effort. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Mark Jeremy Bennett of Hawaii to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Mark Jeremy Bennett of Hawaii to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy,
That's not mine.
Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Resch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester,
and your story's not quite right.
Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Cantwell, Cardin, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Graham, Grassley, Heitkamp, Hyde-Smith, Manchin, Murray, Perdue, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse. Mr. Inhofe voted in the negative.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Flake, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mrs. Ernst, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Risch, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Paul, no.
Did you get that? I did.
Mr. Gardner, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no.
All senators voted. Any senator wish to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 72, the nays are 25. The motion is agreed to.
President.
Senator from Ohio.
We in a quorum call? No?
We are not.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier this month, the Fed released the results of its annual stress tests, exercises designed to ensure that the largest banks can withstand economic shocks and won't need another taxpayer bailout in the event of a crisis. These stress tests were not in effect a decade ago, before the last crisis, and likely would have prevented or made much softer the economic landing that we had. What happened with these tests illustrates exactly what happened with these annual stress tests that just came out, illustrates exactly what's wrong with Washington, what's wrong with this Congress, and what's wrong with Wall Street. The Fed allowed the 7 largest banks to redirect $96 billion, that's 96,000 million, $96 billion that would be used to pay workers or reduce fees for consumers or to protect taxpayers from bailouts. Instead, it allowed the 7 largest banks to plow that money into share buybacks and dividends to reward wealthy executives and generally wealthy investors. 2 banks, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, 2 banks had capital below the required amounts. That's right, those banks failed the test, but they got passing grades anyway. The Fed called them up, let them haggle over the test results, and allowed them to proceed with buybacks and dividends that fundamentally drained their required capital. In what classroom in America would a teacher grade a paper, preliminarily given an F, then negotiate with the student over test results, and then say, okay, you passed. But the stakes in this case are a lot higher than one midterm exam. We're talking about the biggest banks in the country. We're talking about whether they send money to the wealthiest investors or instead have enough skin in the game to protect taxpayers. So why are these buybacks such a problem? Share buybacks and dividends juice stock prices, but do little to increase long-term growth in companies and do very little to reward the workers that make a company's success possible. During the last crisis, Mr. President, we saw big banks send money out the door with buybacks and dividends just months before they imploded and cost taxpayers billions. Watchdogs in the Bush administration had the tools to intervene sooner, but instead they courted Wall Street at the expense of the rest of the country. And some of the regulators today were in the Treasury Department, in the Bush White House, in the Fed in those days, and didn't see the crisis coming, turned their backs and said it's okay to allow these dividends and allow these stock buybacks. Now, back to this year, the 7 largest banks in the country increased their 28 stock dividends paid to investors by 24% compared to last year. And of the banks the Fed allowed to increase their stock buybacks, they increased their repurchases by a stunning 63%. What teller, what salesperson, what branch bank manager in Lorain, Ohio, or Mansfield, Ohio, or Miamisburg, Ohio, what bank manager, what salesperson, what teller got a raise like that in the last year? Mr. President, my colleagues don't think much about this, but the average teller in America makes $12.50 an hour. Bank executives are making $5 and $10 and $20 million, get big raises on top of that, get stock buybacks, juicing their compensation as their stock holdings go up and up, yet the average teller makes $12.50 an hour. Wells Fargo doubled its buybacks, an increase of 100%. The money spent on stock buybacks alone is 314 times what it would cost the bank to boost employee wages to $15 an hour. Remember what I said, $12.50 an hour the average teller makes in this country. Wells CEO Tim Sloan got a 36% raise last year, even in the wake of scandal after scandal after scandal at Wells Fargo. I've found the ads that you see all over the place, watching a Cleveland Indians game on TV, sitting in my living room in Cleveland. I've seen these ads in Washington. I've seen them all over, how Wells Fargo is going to learn from its past mistakes. They were once a great company. They failed. Now they'll be a great company again. But they gave their CEO, who clearly has had some serious issues at that bank, a 36% raise. So we have Wall Street, again, tellers $12.50 an hour. We have Wall Street banks rewarding themselves rather than workers, and in the process, draining the capital that should be their safeguard against taxpayer bailouts. I hear my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we'll never allow a bailout again. Well, we're doing things that will set us up to do that because we're moving away from the reforms we made. The problem's getting worse. The Fed wants to make the tests even easier next year, weakening the key constraint that caused Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley to fail this year, or would have caused them to fail if they hadn't talked their way out of it. Quite a student that can talk their teacher out of it. Federal Reserve Vice Chair Randall Quarles has also floated giving more leeway to banks to comment on the tests before they're administered. Now, I like Vice Chairman Quarles. I did not vote to confirm him. I like him. I respect him. I've sat across the table from him for 2 or 3 hours probably total over his time there. And I assume I will get to know him better as we talk on these issues. But he was in the Bush administration as the crisis built when the economy was about to implode. He said things were rosy. We are trusting him. He's in charge. He's the vice chair of supervision. We're trusting him and others at the Fed to say that it's okay. It's okay to give leeway to bankers to comment on the test before they're administered. It's like letting students help write the exam. We wouldn't do that anywhere else, but we do it with banks who risk our economy with their instability. And they're even considering, Mr. President, dropping the qualitative portion of the stress tests altogether. That's the part of the test that examines banks' risk management processes, data systems, and the fitness of its very well-paid board of directors. I'm not sure of the precise number, but boards of directors in the 7 largest banks, I believe all of them make at least $200,000 a year. I know they average significantly more than that. For part-time jobs, important jobs, they also have other jobs, most of them important jobs, but jobs where they so often seem to turn their head at all these problems. Banks like Deutsche Bank, Santander, HSBC, RBS, all foreign-owned banks, and Citigroup, an American bank, all have failed on qualitative grounds before. But rather than taking that as evidence that these banks need to shape up, they're considering scrapping this critical part of the exam. The Dodd-Frank rollback bill this Congress just passed will also make things worse next year. Right now, the Fed is considering how to replace existing stress tests for banks with between $100 and $250 billion in assets to make them easier on the banks and less frequent. Easier on the banks and less frequent. And rather than having an annual having annual company-run stress tests for the largest banks, those with more than $250 billion in assets. The tests now, because of the new law that bank lobbyists and President Trump wanted, the tests will only be required to be periodic. They used to be annual. Now we're saying periodic. Who interprets periodic? A bunch of Fed regulators that already have shown to be too close to bank interests. All this test curving comes alongside the weakening of other financial protections, dismantling Consumer Protection Bureau, undermining the Volcker Rule, weakening the Community Reinvestment Act as if there is no discrimination in this country anymore, loosening rules around bank capital. Imagine if the people in this town listened as much to workers as they did to Wall Street bankers. But money talks in this town. Lobbyist talks representing money. Wall Street talks representing money. Wall Street executives talk representing money. Let's see. Now, we have very profitable banks, banks that we taxpayers bailed out. We have very profitable banks in this country. Congress, in the last year, gave these banks huge tax cuts. Congress passed a deregulation bill that these banks demanded. Congress, we saw an article in the paper recently that Wall Street is retooling their whole lobbyist network in Washington because they didn't get quite enough on the banking deregulation bill. They thought it did too much. They thought it did a lot for community banks and mid-sized banks, but not enough for the big guys. So they're retooling I'm not making this up, they're retooling their lobbyist organization operations so they can do better. You have a vice chair of supervision who clearly favors Wall Street in the rules that he's already suggested. Boy, Mr. President, it's good to be a bank. It's great to be a banker in America, and it's great to be a banker in 2018. It's great to be a banker in Trump's America.